Section 18 of Versailles by Karl Friedrich Nowak. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. The Struggle Against the Peace Treaty, Part 1. The instrument of the Peace Treaty, a book of over 300 pages in parallel columns, on the left the French, on the right the English version, became forthwith the object of intensive study on the part of the German delegation. The whole of the enormous text, the actual number of words in which it already formed an impressive feature in reports sent by American correspondents to their papers, was transmitted to the German government during the night of May 7 to 8 on the private wireless installation of the German delegation. And meanwhile, Dr. Siemens prepared a detailed program for the rapid systematic survey of the whole of the treaty under various subdivisions according to subject matter. The one copy handed to the foreign minister was, of course, insufficient, and Dr. Siemens preferred an urgent request for several more copies immediately after the formal ceremony. He received these the same evening, and the volumes were then dissected and handed in parts to the translators, who set to work with feverish haste. The work of translation lasted from the moment the plenipotentiaries returned to the Hôtel des Reservoirs from the meeting in the Trianon Palace Hotel up to the middle of the following night. To avoid the loss of a single minute, the text was handed out to the various committees almost sheet by sheet. 3 main committees, corresponding to the threefold composition of the delegation as arranged by Count Brockdorff-Rantzau, were appointed to examine the peace terms under the general direction and control of the foreign minister himself. All the political and military questions were allotted to one group of experts for examination and comment, Secretary of State von Henniel on the political side and General von Siecht on the military side, being responsible for the coordination and control, under the foreign minister, of this committee's work. A subcommittee was appointed to report on the treatment of the war guilt question in the treaty. A second main group was formed to deal with all economic problems under the chairmanship of Herr von Stockhammer, and this again found itself obliged, in view of the range and importance of the questions to be covered, to appoint several subcommittees, of which the chief was the Finance Committee under Herr Max Warburg, the banker. The third main group summarized and reported on the enemy attitude toward labor legislation and social questions, and was presided over by Herr Giesberts, assisted by the labor leader, Herr Legion. Dr. Siemens reserved to himself the task of preparing a comprehensive memorandum on the conclusions and final attitude and judgment of the first main committee. 48 hours elapsed before even a preliminary general survey could be made of the substance and tendency of the treaty, which, it must be remembered, had remained up to that moment a complete secret to the German plenipotentiaries, both as regards the arrangement and selection of its materials and the spirit of its demands, big and small. On the very first reading, the linguists among the delegates had been struck by an inexplicable vagueness, ambiguity, or ruggedness of the French text, usually a model of clarity and precision, and also by apparent mutual inconsistencies between various conditions, or between certain conditions and actual facts. But such impressions, anyhow of doubtful reliability on a first hurried perusal, were disregarded for the present. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau's first and immediate concern was to get the total impression, the general picture as it appeared to the various committees, with a view to forming a considered judgment on the treaty as a whole, which he was meanwhile carefully studying for himself. This judgment, when it came, was annihilating. The foreign minister summoned a special meeting of the chairman of all committees on the evening of May 9th. It began just after 8 p.m. and lasted far into the night. It was confined to an exchange of views on the main aspects only, each chapter of the treaty being surveyed in broad outline. But every group had already formed the same opinion, which was expressed by the chairman with warm indignation and resolute determination to reject the whole of the terms. Each speaker only added in quick succession further details that reinforced the disconsolate picture painted by the colleagues who preceded him. Every one of the experts took the view that what the enemy was proposing or demanding, or rather dictating, was totally unacceptable, and all voted for declaring that it was impossible to sign such a treaty. The foreign minister himself had gained the same impression of the terms. As he put it, quote, "This fat volume was quite unnecessary. They could have expressed the whole thing more simply in one clause. L'Allemand renonce à son existence." End quote. One of the delegates moved that they should give their answer by straightway leaving Versailles. This proposition was supported by most of the others. In hot resentment, they advocated a complete and immediate breaking off of the negotiations and departure for Germany. Some, however, counseled moderation, and all looked to Count Brockdorff-Rantzau for his decision. The foreign minister had in mind all the attempts that the French premier had made to humiliate him only 48 hours ago. It had been plain that no leniency was to be expected from the peace terms, yet much of Germany's future welfare depended on what concessions he could wrest from an obdurate enemy by means of an adroit technique of negotiation. He announced his decision. They would not go yet. He would try once more to get into touch with the enemy and open up negotiations. This at least had the effect of keeping up the delegates' courage and maintaining a scintilla of hope. They dispersed at 3 a.m. On that same day, Count Rantzau sent a memorandum to the chairman of the peace conference saying that a first cursory examination of the peace terms had already brought to light demands, quote, "beyond endurance for any nation," end quote. Further, his experts would bring evidence to prove that many of the provisions of the treaty were actually incapable of fulfillment. He would transmit to the peace conference as quickly as possible all the necessary remarks and data in support of these contentions. The foreign minister was well aware that he could not hope to modify all the harshnesses and enormities in the terms, but he was determined somehow, if necessary by stratagem or by some indirect means, to force a discussion, at any rate, of the most painful and mortifying among them. The French premier replied in a few terse, frigid phrases, quote, "The representatives of the Allied and associated powers cannot enter into any sort of discussion regarding their right to maintain the chief provisions of the treaty in the form in which they are now drawn up. They can only take note of any practical suggestions which the German plenipotentiaries may have to place before them." End quote. Count Rantzau carefully ignored the first sentence of this memorandum and seized on the opening which, in spite of it, the second sentence gave. If practical suggestions were admitted, then some reference would be possible to all the most important points. Within the next 4.5 weeks, the various committees of the German delegation put into the form of suggestions 17 notes. To begin with, enlightenment was requested on certain obscurities in the sections dealing with the League of Nations. It was not apparent why Germany should be called upon to subscribe to the statutes of such a league if she were to be entirely excluded from it. Information was desired whether this exclusion was merely a temporary one and whether the possibility of Germany's subsequent entry into the League would be safeguarded. And since the foreign minister was sending this note on the subject of the League of Nations, he ventured to append, as they were sure to contain here and there a few practical suggestions, the carefully considered detailed proposals which he had already had prepared on a worldwide association of peoples. His policy was to select for treatment in the first instance the less thorny points among the immense number of provisions which involved acute hardship. Following his remarks on the League of Nations, he went on to deal with labor legislation, for it was only natural that the representative of a new Germany freed from her old, formidable militarist basis should be primarily concerned with the peaceable, everyday pursuits of humanity. From workers' rights under the new regime, he turned to the alleviation of the hardships of the German prisoners. Only after all these matters had been dealt with did he approach the subjects of war guilt, economic matters, and cessions of territory, the bitterest chapters following the loss of the war, which had condemned Germany to utter impotence and, if the victors thought fit, to the denial of all justice. The notes were presented at intervals of a very few days. Two each were devoted to the questions of labor legislation and war prisoners. They were all courteously phrased, concise, and to the point, constantly supported by references to the definite agreement which had been entered into by the two groups of belligerents after the acceptance on both sides of the Wilson Program in order to bring hostilities to an end and frame a peace. Amongst the conditions included in the peace treaty, which had been handed to them, the German plenipotentiaries had discovered infringements of that agreement and interpretations which were in direct opposition to it. As the chairman of the conference, perhaps for this very reason, declined to allow any negotiation or discussion of the peace document, the Germans were all the more intent on challenging those contraventions of the agreement within the limits of the suggestions which they were permitted to make. They had no intention of appealing to the enemy's clemency or of trading on their weakness. They claimed their share of the justice which had been proclaimed as the right of every nation. The demands contained in the peace treaty were almost entirely at variance with what the President of the United States had promised in his sketch of the coming world peace. But it was that promise of his which formed the basis of the compact, and in their suggestions, the German plenipotentiaries merely claimed for Germany the honoring of the undertakings given in the agreement of November 1918. Since the President of the United States had stood surety for those undertakings, the peace conference could not, so the Germans argued, possibly revoke them. Clemenceau clearly differed. In the first place, he seemed entirely to deny that the peace terms contravened the Wilson Program. The Germans knew nothing of the struggles that had taken place between Clemenceau and Wilson, Clemenceau and Lloyd George, Clemenceau and the two together. No one then knew how very serious these struggles had been, and this might never have come to light in view of the final agreement between the three. Even if it had, it might have made no difference to the treaty now that they had set their hands to it. In the second place, Clemenceau had not the slightest intention of embarking on any discussions on the subject now that all power was in his hands. He replied to the German notes with elaborate courtesy. The committees of the German delegation had prepared each of their notes under the greatest pressure, often almost overnight, and the chairman of the conference took care to ensure that, though his own staff could not compete in zeal to that extent, the replies should reach the Germans at latest within 10 days. But he made no real concessions. When the German plenipotentiaries put forward proposals touching the League of Nations, the moral implications of the treaty, and the possibility of improving on them, the French Prime Minister replied that in this opinion, quote, the provisions of the peace treaty were much more practical and suitable, end quote. When the Germans, in their League of Nations scheme, suggested the creation of conciliation commissions which should intervene without prejudice to the overriding authority of the International Court of Justice in cases of dispute and institute an inquiry, the chairman of the conference regarded it as the greatest of concessions when in his reply he stated that, quote, there is nothing in the wording of the peace treaty which prohibits the employment of commissions of the kind suggested, end quote. The prevailing tone of the notes sent out from the conference was that of a supreme world court, which has laid down an impeccable set of regulations for the universe and is determined that they shall be enforced without any variation. Moreover, the formal politeness of his replies did not prevent the chairman from bringing in, here and there, sentences, mostly the work of Clemenceau's drafting secretary, Mandel, which reminded the German delegates once again of the position in which they were placed and the German nation with them. They not only had to sign without a murmur whatever the Supreme Council of Four had devised and approved, they must also, since they insisted on this entirely superfluous exchange of notes, sit in the dock, as they had done at the first big meeting at the Trianon Palace Hotel, and swallow continual doses of moral correction and snubs. The notes sent by the chairman of the conference boasted of the wisdom of the, quote, allied and associated democracies, which have had a very long experience of democratic institutions, end quote, from which it followed without further need of explanation that the German proposals on labor legislation could contain nothing that was not already much better arranged in the peace treaty. when the Germans referred to, quote, special measures of social reform, end quote, the chairman in his next refusal took care not to omit to assert that, quote, such measures could and would undoubtedly have been put into effect already if Germany's wanton attack had not diverted the efforts and thoughts of the whole world away from such preoccupations to the struggle for freedom, and so compelled the other nations to subordinate their efforts for the new ideals to the defense of their independence, end quote. The German foreign minister had to summon all his self-command and imperturbability not to let the attacks and the aggressiveness of his opponent make him forget the object he was so painfully pursuing. Occasionally, when the French prime minister went beyond mere insistence on the terms and tried to support them by charges which were neither logical nor founded on facts, he would give back blow for blow. When, for example, Count Brockdorff-Rantzau demanded equality of treatment as regards the release of prisoners of war, pointed out that Germany had set free unconditionally even those accused of criminal or other offenses, and claimed that similar standards should apply to both sides, the chairman of the peace conference replied in a note which included the following passage, quote, since there is no possible comparison between the German government's treatment of its prisoners and that of the Allied and associated governments, no equality of treatment in this respect can be claimed, end quote. It was a great deal for the chairman to make up his mind to cite actual cases in proof of his charges, but on the question of the conviction of prisoners abroad for criminal offenses, he did so, and gave particulars of how a German soldier had murdered a French farmer with a pruning knife. But the foreign minister was prompt in his rejoinder. He demanded the appointment of a commission to investigate the whole question of the treatment of prisoners of war, and as a pendant to the story of the pruning knife, he was able to give the following statistics. Quote, among the released prisoners belonging to one of the Allied and associated powers, there were 7 men who had been guilty of murder during their imprisonment, and 155 who had been convicted of offenses against morality, particularly rape and the violation of children. One of the worst cases was that of Private Émile Villequez of the 35th French Infantry Regiment, who killed an old German peasant woman with a hatchet, end quote. The German delegation had other information besides. A copy of a letter they had received was enclosed for the chairman's information. Quote, Saint-Étienne du Rouvray, Nier-Rouen, Seine-Inférieure, February 15, 1919. Sir, please excuse us for writing to you. We are wives of men who have been called up for military service, and we should like to tell you what is going on in our town of Saint-Étienne. The German prisoners employed on the railway here are treated like convicts, beaten like dogs, and not given enough to eat. It is heartbreaking for us wives and mothers of soldiers to see these men dying of hunger. Although we ourselves are short of bread, we cannot help throwing them some now and then when we have a chance. They pounce on it like famished animals. The French warders treat them brutally, just on account of a bit of bread. Sir, we hope you will take steps to improve their lot. We have already written to several departments about it, but unfortunately without any result. Yours truly, a group of working women in Saint-Étienne du Rouvray, end quote. The chairman of the peace conference did not continue the correspondence on this sentimental topic, nor did he modify his attitude on the question. He cared nothing for protests, whether supported by facts or not. If the German plenipotentiaries did not like his expressing his real opinions about them and their country, and their claims even in the polished style he had hitherto adopted, he could just as well say nothing. The stubbornness of his peasant ancestors came out here. He was accustomed to express himself more forcibly as a rule, but he was reluctant to let himself go in a correspondence conducted not only for himself, but on behalf of allies. In the circumstances, his silence was sufficiently telling. The whole exchange of notes had been, up to now, a struggle without result, and hence without meaning. Of course, the German foreign minister was not solely concerned for social reform when he devoted 2 notes to proposals regarding labor legislation, while still more important, or at any rate more obvious, matters seemed to be calling for settlement. He had other ends to serve as well. He wanted to bring into the peace negotiations the powerful voice of the organized labor movement of the whole world. He had hopes that, if an international trades union congress could be got together at Versailles to discuss, first of all, the sections of the treaty affecting the workers, and later, perhaps, other topics, while the conference was sitting, the enemy might be forced to set some bounds to their conscienceless violence. He himself was neither unfamiliar nor on bad terms with the labor movement, and he did not despair even of getting into touch indirectly with the French section, whose voice, if they too raised a protest against all this trampling on justice, could not be disregarded by the Congress. But Clemenceau thwarted this scheme too. He rejected the proposal to convene an international labor organization at Versailles, which would confer and report on legislation affecting the workers of all countries. Quote, "There is no country," Clemenceau wrote in reply to Count Rantzau, "in which the workers would at present be prepared to submit meekly to legislation imposed upon them by representatives of other countries. It is clear, therefore, that international pacts of the nature visualized by the peace treaty would be more effective in present circumstances than actual international labor legislation." End quote. More than that, the chairman of the peace conference countered the German plan by extolling the patriotism of the French working classes. Whether he was justified in his faith may be open to doubt, but at all events he had the power of preventing any invitation or any possible attempt of the French labor movement to intervene in the events taking place at Versailles. He held the trumps at every deal, and at every stage, in order to deter possible intercessors and to represent the excessive demands of the peace treaty as legitimate severity, he observed towards the German plenipotentiaries the icy formality with which even convicted criminals are treated. There was to be no appeal from this conviction, neither from without nor from within. Germany had been pronounced guilty. She had herself admitted her guilt by the agreement of November 5, 1918, and a peace treaty was only repeating this acknowledgment in set terms in the section on reparations. Evildoers who had been overpowered had no right to raise claims. They had only to hear judgment passed and to sign their names to it. The German foreign minister, who from the outset of his task had kept his attention fixed on the central issue from which all the enemy's demands and exactions proceeded, very soon realized that he would make no progress along these lines, and that his notes were of merely minor importance, besides offering no hope of success, so long as he had not challenged and disposed of that central issue. He came back to the question of war guilt. Everything hung on that. He determined to pursue the discussion. The German delegation knew that the peace conference had appointed a secret committee to study the question of war guilt, of the responsibility of various individuals for the outbreak of war, and for certain measures carried out during the war, and to report on the feasibility of demanding the surrender of those alleged to be guilty and bringing them before an international court of justice. The conference attached particular importance to this latter problem, and Lloyd George especially had been constantly referring in his public speeches to the prospect of giving effect to one exemplary solution of it, namely the surrender of the German Emperor, William II, and his trial before a court which would establish the blame for everything that had happened in the eyes of the whole world. It was inevitable that the conference should attach the greatest importance to the labors and conclusions of such a committee. Not only did the French Prime Minister need its support to lend an air of justice to his demands for revenge, compensation, and other unjustifiable benefits for France, but France's allies and friends needed it just as much for their moral comfort if they were to look on and see the sort of treatment that was meted out to Germany. In any case, the peace conference had laid it down that all the sin, and hence all the atonement, lay with Germany, and since might was on their side, they need not necessarily condescend to go into details. If, however, this special committee could adduce incontrovertible evidence of German culpability and German responsibility, collective and individual, then the moral basis of the conference would indeed be improved. The committee received instructions to proceed with the greatest possible speed and to report their findings urgently to the Council of Four. News of this investigation by a committee under the directions of the Peace Conference had reached the German plenipotentiaries in confidence about the middle of May. They learned more than the bare fact that the special committee was in being. They learned particulars of its report, or at least of certain important parts of it. The American experts on the committee had given their opinion that, while no one could deny that an enormous power of decision rested with the Kaiser at the time of the outbreak of the war, it would be juridically impossible to fasten onto him the sole responsibility for the war and to demand his extradition and prosecute him. The Japanese experts would not hear of any such thing. If it were established that a once powerful monarch could be haled before the courts, it was not impossible that circumstances might arise one day in which the same fate might be proposed and put into execution for the Mikado himself. For them, the monarch stood high above all responsibility, and they were apprehensive lest the royal immunity should be called in question. Thus, the special committee had not made a great deal of progress with its labors. The question of the Kaiser's extradition was dropped. This development reacted not altogether favorably on the scheme for laying the whole of the blame on Germany. The minutes of the special committee went before the Council of Four, but no new or incontrovertible data could be gleaned from them. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau was well primed with information as to the investigation and its outcome. He advanced to the attack. But although his entourage, his confidants, his wholehearted supporter and lieutenant, Dr. Siemens, all his colleagues in the delegation, in fact, shared his views on this point, as on others, Count Brockdorff-Rantzau's position was nevertheless that of a lonely, hard-pressed outpost. He had already brought up the question of war guilt once in the Trianon Palace Hotel, under provocation from Clemenceau, but this had been on his own initiative, in the resentful feeling that he could not simply let the adversary in Versailles behave as though he were passing sentence on an evildoer who was contritely presenting himself for judgment. After the French prime minister had spoken in the tone he had thought fit to adopt, it had been necessary to tell him that on his side, too, they had much to reproach themselves with, and that Count Rantzau was not going to admit that any legal justification for a policy of violence could be based on unproven charges. There had perhaps been complaints about his attitude in the council chamber of the Four, but he had not been the first to open this subject, which he had foreseen would be the fundamental basis of the whole of the peace terms. It was naturally awkward for the enemy that he had taken up Clemenceau's challenge and turned it into a weapon of defense. It would suit them better, no doubt, if the Germans let the matter rest. But it was not only from the Council of Four that complaints arose that Count Brockdorff-Rantzau did not accept all responsibility for Germany without a murmur. Complaints came from Germany herself, or rather from the German government. Telegrams from Berlin on the wisdom of opening up a debate on war guilt had begun to pour in soon after the day on which the foreign minister had made his big speech at the handing over of the peace terms. Not that the Berlin cabinet were any less horrified on reading the text of the treaty, which they had before them in a hastily prepared translation containing an imposing number of howlers, than Count Rantzau and his experts had been after their first cursory glance at the document. President Ebert and the Prime Minister, Philipp Scheidemann, had addressed the crowd from the windows of the Chancellor's palace, quote, "Let the hand wither," end quote, which should sign such a dictated peace. They were determined to resist. But the cabinet and the peace delegation did not see entirely eye to eye as to the best methods of dealing with the enemy's demands. Erzberger offered constant and vigorous opposition to the idea of going into the question of war guilt at Versailles. He was to a large extent justified in regarding the armistice agreement as his work, and he saw this agreement menaced if embittered discussions on the one topic of responsibility for the war should destroy the whole fabric of peace. About a fortnight after he had signed the armistice agreement in the Bois de Compiègne, the first two diplomatic representatives of France since the war had arrived in the German capital. These were Professors Hagenen and Hesnard, both by scientific training Germanists, Hagenen having been for many years a professor at the Berlin University, and both perfect masters of the German language. They had been sent to Germany by President Poincaré and Clemenceau as observers to report, pending the appointment of a French chargé d'affaires, on all they could glean of the new atmosphere in that country, of its inward feelings and development, of the really controlling forces and motives of which neither the Paris government nor the Peace Conference had any clear conception. The two professors soon got into touch with Erzberger, much to the gratification of both sides, of the Frenchmen because by this means they were able to obtain information more easily as to the feelings and proceedings of the cabinet and of the whole of Germany, otherwise only a seething inchoate mass for them. Of the German ministers still more, because some faint ray of enlightenment on the enemy's intentions in Versailles might now and then be obtainable through the French emissaries, particularly as Professor Hagenen was known to be in direct and confidential correspondence with Clemenceau. The German delegation got no direct news at all of the plans or doings of the other side. The German cabinet's information was limited to the reports received from its plenipotentiaries. But Erzberger now had a bridge leading direct to France, and he was in effect the sole recipient of information of any sort from France, even if only through the two observers as intermediaries. He regarded this channel as of great importance, as in fact it was to some extent, and he certainly succeeded in impressing the rest of the cabinet with a sense of the importance of his conversations with the two Frenchmen. Matthias Erzberger was a man of restless activity, with a vivid, rapidly working imagination, starting from practical details, but apt to carry him on to higher and higher flights, so that he saw the ultimate result of his aims more clearly than the difficulties in the way of their execution. He was ambitious, with the honest conviction that he was heading entirely in the right direction and could see the path in advance of others. But he was inspired by a sincere desire to rehabilitate the fallen fortunes of Germany at the earliest possible moment, to put an end to the long years of terrible suffering, and above all, to bring peace after his first success, as he saw it, in engineering the armistice agreement. And as, with all this, he displayed an immense power of concentrated industry and unending resourcefulness, the two Frenchmen found him a stimulating personality of constant interest, bubbling over with ideas and an eloquent flood of exposition. They listened attentively to the minister's scheme for reconstruction in Belgium and northern France on a grandiose scale. Imaginatively, he pictured the ruined towns, the whole regions of destruction and wreckage, already rebuilt by armies of German workmen. Everything, as he conceived it, was brand new and far finer than it had ever been before. The most up-to-date technical methods were to be employed. Electric power was to be the most prominent feature. The contracts were to be divided between the French and German industrialists, and the whole work supervised and directed by a special French commission of control. All parties concerned would be benefited. The devastated countryside, the German workers, the industrial interests, and, so far as contracts were entrusted to German firms, the reparation fund, which would reap substantial cash remittances. The two Frenchmen listened, and Professor Hagenen may have written to Paris about the scheme. In any case, he had no reason to be anything but polite to Herr Erzberger, who was untiring in his display of goodwill and of dazzling oratory. The professor seemed to be inclined to share the view that it was time all these regrettable misunderstandings ceased between two great nations. He had no doubt that some day in the future a complete and lasting reconciliation would ensue. Nor did he seem to think that everything need be taken quite so tragically as the peace terms made it out at present. Drafting demands, signing their acceptance, and carrying them out were three stages divided by the flowing stream of time. Leniency might later on be allowed to come into play, and there would surely be some change later on from the present meticulous insistence on the accurate pound of flesh. Whether it would help leniency along its slow road to be obstructive at Versailles, to make difficulties, to haggle over points of legality, when the only thing that counted in the slightest was force, that was another question. Professor Hagenen could well imagine that it might be best to give way at present and gain all the more later from the ready indulgence of the ex-enemy. Erzberger at once saw the force of the professor's argument, though it was only thrown out in quite general terms. As a Roman Catholic and leader of the Center Party, he found an inward satisfaction in the application of the ideas of repentance and expiation, forgiveness, and the redemption and future reward of the penitent. Fresh from these discussions with the French observers, he went to the cabinet and represented the substance of what he had heard, which no one could check, as a reasonably well-founded political forecast. Believing in these hypotheses as he did, his imagination saw them hardened into future facts, and he displayed them to his cabinet colleagues as confidential communications for the genuineness of which he was ready to vouch. At all events, they served as reasons for not wanting the German plenipotentiaries at Versailles to deal tactlessly with the question of war guilt. How could the enemy ever forgive if they were met merely with pig-headedness? Nothing could be gained in the existing condition of utter defeat by attempts to show defiance. The cabinet wavered. Notwithstanding Erzberger's inferences and arguments, a number of the ministers viewed any prophecies of lenience with skepticism. But these reports of Erzberger's interviews with the two Frenchmen were the only news that they had. It was certainly sound policy not to irritate the enemy, and perhaps the argument about guilty or not guilty was, after all, only a bit of moralizing. All the other questions in the peace treaty were of greater importance. Finally, Erzberger's influence began to prevail. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau must be told to drop this delicate subject. The cabinet started sending telegrams. However, their wording varied. Their message was unchanging, only sent in more and more urgent tones. The question of war guilt was not to be discussed at all. Viewing the question, however, from Versailles, Count Brockdorff-Rantzau did not regard it as merely a bit of moralizing. He saw behind it a number of things that the enemy would only have the courage to demand when Germany had been convicted of sole guilt. He, as foreign minister, was responsible for conducting Germany's policy in regard to foreign countries. Thrown on his own resources to defend his country, only he, here at Versailles, could be the judge of his technique and tactics, and no one else. He took no notice of the directions from Berlin. If the work he was doing did not meet with the approval of the government, let the president recall him. He instructed Dr. Siemens to prepare the memorandum on war guilt, which had been decided on. The Allies' justification for making Germany shoulder the obligation to make good all damage caused by the war, whether to territory, industrial plant, or private property, was contained in one single sentence of the treaty. Quote, "The Allied and associated governments affirm and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies." End quote. In a note dated May 13th, Dr. Simons nailed to the counter that prime misconception which had led through this apodictically proclaimed accusation of Germany, together with the suggestion that Germany had already acknowledged in November 1918 the truth and justice of that accusation, to the imposition of an apparently unlimited penance for the whole German nation. He protested against the assumption, quote, that the alleged responsibility of the former German government for the outbreak of the war should be regarded as justifying or right or claim on the part of the Allied and associated governments to compensation from Germany for the losses they sustained during the war. End quote. He asserted that there was a misunderstanding and that Germany had never admitted responsibility for the war. The declaration referred to by the peace conference had been made in November 1918, before any discussion had taken place regarding the responsibility for the war. This was an attempt to make the new, democratized Germany do penance for the ethical and other errors of a previous government, now superseded, regardless of the fact that such a course was inconsistent with the spirit of the Wilsonian basis of peace. End of section 18. Section 19 of Versailles by Karl Friedrich Nowak. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. The Struggle Against the Peace Treaty, Part 2. He did not mean it to be inferred that Germany was entirely blameless for the events of 1914, but for one thing, Germany was not alone to blame, and secondly, she had not been the worst offender. The peace conference had, he understood, appointed a commission for investigating the responsibilities of the authors of the war. The German plenipotentiaries did not shrink from a full discussion of this subject and requested to be furnished with a copy of the report of that commission. Clemenceau replied once more with frigid politeness, and this time claimed to give chapter and verse for the German acknowledgement of responsibility. The attempts to avoid the admission of guilt could only, he said, be explained by consciousness of guilt. Germany had recognized clearly in November 1918 that it was for her only to make good the damage caused by her, quote, attack by land and sea and in the air, end quote. It was too late now for her to attempt to repudiate the blame. As regards the liability of the new Germany for the sins of the previous government, Germany had not asked the French Republic in 1871 whether it was willing to answer for the misdeeds of Imperial France or not. At Brest-Litovsk, too, the Germans had insisted on the new Russia accepting terms which constituted a punishment of Tsarism. The French Prime Minister did not deny that a commission appointed by the Peace Conference had been investigating the question of war guilt, but he pointed out that proceedings within the Allied camp did not concern the German delegation, and still less confidential reports called for by the Council of Four. The chairman of the Peace Conference had taken a week to reply. 4 days later, the German foreign minister signed a further rejoinder on the subject of responsibility for war damages. In this note, Dr. Siemens had endeavored to bring out with special emphasis the critical fact of Clemenceau's wholesale confusion of thought. Germany had acknowledged at the time of the armistice in November 1918 that she had been guilty at the commencement of the war of an offense against international law in invading a neutral country, Belgium, and laying it waste with war. This was the aggression for the consequence of which Germany had acknowledged herself responsible. The chairman of the Peace Conference was twisting this acknowledged liability for a single illegal act into a recognition by Germany of authorship of and sole guilt for the World War. He had arbitrarily extended the admission of responsibility by the German government in November 1918, and now asserted that the Germans had subscribed to that extended interpretation at the time, and that it was therefore a matter long ago disposed of. The original declaration had employed the expression attack, meaning by this the invasion of Belgium. The Prime Minister had substituted the word war for the word attack. He was now anxious to prevent further investigation of this confusion of thought, but the German delegation insisted on this investigation being carried out. It was an attempt to get behind what the President of the United States had proclaimed in his resounding messages in his attempt to reconcile the nations of the world. No annexations, no penal indemnities, no act of vengeance of any kind. The German delegation, said Dr. Siemens, is loath to interpret Your Excellency's words as meaning that the promises of the Allied and associated governments on that occasion were only a ruse de guerre to weaken the resistance of the German people, and that those promises are now to be withdrawn, end quote. Over and above the attempt now being made by this peace conference to dislodge one of the cornerstones of the settlement defined by the President of the United States, the French Prime Minister had been guilty, according to the German legal experts, of a palpable piece of trickery. He had built up certain arguments and conclusions from premises which were non-existent and had only been created by himself for his own purposes. If the, quote, attack by land and sea and in the air, end quote, referred to in November 1918, meant the attack on Belgium, then only the damage caused to Belgium had to be made good, except that, as the infringement of international law had consisted in marching through Belgium to northern France, the same obligation applied to the latter district. If, on the other hand, the attack meant the same thing as war, then reparations were due to Belgium, France, Italy, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, in short, to every country on whose soil a single German soldier had set foot. Thus, the question of war guilt was by no means merely a bit of moralizing. An immense burden for Germany's future depended on a correct interpretation of the problem. The second German note repeated the request for the report of the Special Commission on War Responsibility. It protested against the deliberate misrepresentations of the French Prime Minister and against the resulting confusion of ideas for which he was responsible. It demanded, finally, to be informed on what the peace conference based their suggestion that Germany was alone to blame, seeing that no evidence was adduced to prove the statement and that the German nation had never accepted such blame. The German note concluded by reserving the right to deal specially again on some future occasion with this important subject. The new note on war guilt produced no apparent effect on the peace conference, but a few days later in Berlin, confidential inquiries were made of the ex-ambassador Count Wolf Metternich as to whether he would be prepared, if the occasion arose, to take charge of the negotiations at Versailles. "This inquiry is meaningless," replied the Count, "unless there is some intention of superseding Count Rantzau, but I am in entire agreement with the attitude he has taken up." End quote. 14 days after the formal handing over of the terms of peace, Count Rantzau saw clearly that it would be entirely impracticable to complete his task at Versailles within the time limit of 15 days set by the chairman of the peace conference. He had barely been able to have rough memoranda prepared on the most important and far-reaching of the problems covered by the treaty, and even these had been far from exhaustively drawn up or put into final shape. He had made some slight reference to the subject of territorial surrenders, to the sections in which they were ordered to hand over Alsace-Lorraine, the Saar district, Eupen and Malmedy, Prussian Moresnet, parts of Silesia, Posen, West and East Prussia, but the German plenipotentiaries had not been able to do more than touch superficially on all these territorial problems. To deal adequately with each would mean the marshalling of facts and figures with regard to each. The time limit suggested, a fortnight, would be totally insufficient, even if the various committees worked at the most extreme pressure, for a conscientious examination of this world rearrangement and the expression of a considered opinion on it. On May 20th, Count Rantzau requested the chairman to extend the limit to enable him to deal with the many complicated problems that still remained. In addition to 6 separate notes on important points which he had in hand, he announced to the peace conference that he was about to submit a, quote, summary of the comments which the German government has been led to express on various detailed conditions included in the draft peace treaty, end quote. The foreign minister intended this summary of comments to be the decisive, full German reply to the demands of the peace conference. The notes and rejoinders hitherto prepared were no more than preliminary spade work to define and illuminate the various themes. His idea was now to expatiate in a long, covering memorandum on the general legal basis on which alone a peace treaty between Germany and her enemies could be framed. In this covering letter, the general summary he intended to rehearse with precise documentation all the actual points in which the peace terms conflicted with the agreed bases of the Wilson Program. This would be supported in the main body of the note by the more detailed reports of his experts, arranged according to subject matter and as thorough as circumstances would permit. Concurrently with this critical material, he would offer constructive suggestions for reasonable methods of procedure, compromises, conciliatory measures, and so on. But for this he would need time. The French Prime Minister's answer came promptly, another week. This covering letter was the one big opportunity. and also the last chance that was left of securing better terms for Germany from the peace conference, or of representing certain of the problems in such a way that the Allies would be forced to sit down and listen to verbal arguments. Determined as the foreign minister was to retain full independence for his attitude and actions at Versailles, this last great step was of such importance and involved such far-reaching consequences in its acceptances or refusals that it was essential to carry the cabinet with him in his proposed line of action. The necessities of administrative procedure, too, made it inevitable that he should consult his colleagues, since the opinions of experts in Berlin had to be obtained on certain points of detail. Apart from that, Count Brockdorff-Rantzau had a feeling, which amounted to a certainty, that the cabinet in Berlin was divided in its appreciation of his work and plans. The cabinet raised no objection to the preparation and presentation of a comprehensive covering letter. On the contrary, they even contributed a draft of their own, embodying their idea of the kind of general reply which should be made to the peace conference. The draft, which covered all the chief problems, had been prepared by Erzberger and his staff with that extraordinary speed with which he was always capable, when necessary, of dispatching special work. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau studied the Berlin draft with close attention, but quickly came to the conclusion, which was also formed independently by the experts on his committees, that the main topics calling for treatment at Versailles had been handled by the government draftsmen much too hastily and superficially, without going at all carefully into the points at issue. The foreign minister made up his mind that he would not make use of the Berlin draft. He felt that something more thorough, more effective, more solidly supported was required to repel the attacks of the Allied and associated powers. He preferred to undertake the responsibility for preparing this himself in association with his band of experts. Dr. Siemens encouraged him, quote, "As foreign minister, you don't need anyone else to dictate your notes. You can write them yourself." End quote. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau was, however, anxious to find a modus vivendi. It would perhaps be best to have a personal interview with the cabinet, at which many of these differences which were present under the surface and made themselves felt from Berlin to Versailles might be cleared away and perhaps definitely obviated for the future. He did not want to go to Berlin himself. That would not quite consort with his dignity, to have to go home and report. The expedient of a halfway consultation was agreed upon, and the foreign minister, accompanied by his leading experts, traveled to Spa. The cabinet deputed some of its members to meet him there in order to discuss in an amicable way the best method of proceeding on agreed lines. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau was prepared to welcome any prospect of a return to harmony, but the news he had been receiving from Berlin up to the last few days only served to enhance his sense of divergence from the cabinet's outlook. This was not so much due to the telegraphic dispatches he received direct from the government as to the unofficial discussions, the general kite-flying that had been going on in Berlin almost ever since the delegation reached Versailles. One could not put one's finger on the origin of these feelers, nor say exactly to whom the results of the inquiries were reported, but a web of intrigue was being woven from all ends of the earth, centering always on Berlin. Some individual who had been entrusted by the enemy with preliminary negotiations at Versailles on some matter or other would go away and throw out suggestions in an apparently casual manner, but sufficiently clearly and persistently to make it unquestionable that he was fishing for definite information from the capital. Thus, a Danish businessman living in England had had some non-committal discussions with the foreign minister about the exchange of prisoners. Shortly afterwards, the Dane met a German acquaintance in Copenhagen and asked him, "Will Germany sign or not?" "Count Brockdorff-Rantzau has already stated that he will not," was the reply, "and you can be sure he will keep his word." "I am not talking about Count Brockdorff-Rantzau," the Anglo-Danish merchant went on. "It doesn't matter what Count Rantzau says. If he does not sign, well then, Erzberger will." End quote. As soon as he heard of this, the foreign minister had asked his brother, who held an official position in Berlin, to see the president of the Reich with a message, quote, "If these tales of disagreements in the cabinet get abroad, a situation of the gravest danger will be created." End quote. "My dear Count," the president had replied, "you can set your mind at rest. Your brother has the whole of the cabinet and the unanimous public opinion of Germany behind him." End quote. But the president had admitted that Erzberger's attitude towards the German delegation and the general tone of his criticisms of the work that was being done at Versailles showed signs of a certain degree of jealousy. Count Rantzau had, it is true, invited his colleague in April to take part in the Versailles negotiations in conjunction with a delegation. Quote, "But that did not suit his book," the president had concluded. "He wanted to lead the delegation. But tell your brother to be perfectly easy in his mind. I am backing him unreservedly." End quote. The president of the Reich did, in fact, have a word with Erzberger before the latter left for Spa, with the result that the divergence of view and friction between the two ministers when they met in the Kursaal at Spa was, on the whole, less than either of them had anticipated. Towards the end of the discussions, indeed, quite a conciliatory tone reigned. The Prime Minister, Philip Scheidemann, who had accompanied Erzberger, kept in the background and left the latter to lead the discussion. Several hours were devoted to a detailed consideration of the memorandum which Erzberger had brought with him from Berlin as a sketch of what might be regarded as acceptable. Count Rantzau declined to adopt the precise wording of this draft in his main reply to the peace conference, but after an adjournment of the debate in the Kursaal, a compromise was agreed upon. The contents of the memorandum were to be regarded as a summary indication of how the cabinet stood in principle with regard to the individual problems of the peace. The delegation and its leader were to be left to develop it as they thought fit, and also to take full responsibility for all details of the proposed covering letter. The foreign minister had thus secured essentially what he wanted: to be allowed to reply to the enemy in his own way, with the approval of the cabinet unhampered in his choice of words or of themes, and in the use he made of his material. The delegation returned to Versailles, and the preparation of the covering letter was put in hand. Jurists and industrialists, soldiers and stars in the financial firmament all helped to build this final bastion against which the enemy's rapacity was to beat in vain. It was a last struggle for territory, for population, for honor and security, for national wealth, and for the inviolability of personal property. Germany would refuse to accept terms which clashed almost at every point with the agreement made with the President of the United States, and the delegation once more applied itself feverishly to the task of pointing out all the instances in the treaty in which the Wilsonian principles had been ignored, brushed aside, and treated with contempt. The German delegation entered a solemn protest against the transfer of Alsace-Lorraine without a preliminary plebiscite, against the temporary separation of the Saar district, and against the claim advanced by France to place the Saar under her exclusive domination on the pretext that no other arrangement would secure to her the possession and enjoyment of the coal mines there, which were to provide compensation for the pits destroyed in northern France. They pointed out that compensation for lost coal output and political control were two different things, that the problem here was merely to fix an adequate indemnity on an economic basis, and that no question arose of redetermining political allegiance in a country which had been part of the German Reich, populated by German men and women ever since the Treaty of Versailles in 870. The German delegation insisted, therefore, on this whole question being reopened, with a view to a solution being reached by negotiation on an economic basis, the only possible basis of settlement. Further, the delegation continued to struggle for West Prussia, East Prussia, and Upper Silesia. They did not know that the President of the United States had originally been in favor of Clemenceau's favorite solution of the cession of the whole of Silesia, including even its capital, Breslau. They proved by statistics and historical data that the present proposals were entirely in conflict with all idea of a people's self-determination. They would involve the divorce from the Reich of territory which was purely and entirely German. They therefore rejected this plan. They freely admitted those justifiable cessions of territory which could be made. Districts with definitely Polish population should be transferred to the new state of Poland. But Germany could not part with Danzig. Danzig had been a German city from time immemorial. If it was only a question of finding Poland access to the sea, 2 other ports besides Danzig could be made available. But Germany could not hand over the towns themselves to foreign rule. Further, it would be a clear case of the surrender of indisputably German territory if Germany were to hand over the districts of Eupen and Malmedy to Belgium. If Belgium complained that her forests had been destroyed or seriously damaged by the war, this was a matter for settlement as part of reparations under the heading of, quote, agreements for the supply of timber, end quote, and not otherwise. Germany was determined to give effect to the Wilsonian imperative of the self-determination of peoples everywhere, even in Schleswig, though the president had made no mention of any Schleswig question, and Germany had not been at war with Denmark. Long before the peace conference, Prince Max of Baden had sent Dr. Siemens to Count Moltke, the Danish minister in Berlin, to announce that the German government was ready, quote, to negotiate direct with Denmark regarding a revision of Danish-German relations, end quote. But the German delegation were unable to concur in the procedure now laid down by the peace conference in regard to Schleswig. The limitation of the plebiscite area, the time limit for voting, and the whole method of conducting the plebiscite. Further, there was one special case, one only, in which they claimed that the principle of self-determination should be applied to Germany also, that of German Austria and of German minorities in foreign states and in surrendered territories. So far as German Austria was concerned, there were differences of opinion. Dr. Siemens was really the only member of the delegation who was in favor of bringing the German Austrians into the Reich. Dr. von Stockhammern, who was also consulted, opposed this course. Count Rantzau himself was undecided. At the same time, it was clear that a settlement of this question in her favor offered the only possibility of a gain for Germany in the whole of the peace treaty. If Wilson's principle was to hold good, then the Austrians ought to be allowed to do as they pleased in the matter. The delegation accordingly decided to demand for the German Austrians the right of free decision. Dr. Siemens was responsible for the section on reparations in this final memorandum, whilst the subsection on finance was in the hands of Herr Warburg, as before. The former also dealt, in conjunction with Privy Councillor Gauss, with the sections on international agreements and the punitive clauses, as well as seeing to the coordination of the whole of the material for the memorandum. Dr. Siemens, in fact, had become, under the foreign minister, a sort of general commissary to the peace delegation, and was certainly the hardest worked of all the experts, and the one most frequently consulted on account of his ability as a jurist. He had already written 2 notes on the question of war guilt. He now worked the same material into his section on reparations, claiming that Germany must be given a clear indication of the limits of her obligations, and showing that this was only practicable if the war guilt question was settled. The framework of the clauses dealing with Austria was also Dr. Siemens' handiwork, and the exposition of the Alsace-Lorraine problem, apart from technical questions of railway administration, was almost entirely based on an original draft of his. The German opposition to the peace terms was embodied in this man, next to the foreign minister himself, and was reinforced and organized by his efforts. The draft treaty was regarded by the whole of the German delegation as one great illegality, and the eminent jurist they possessed in Dr. Siemens was not only their obvious standard-bearer in the campaign against illegality, but also the best man to devise means of countering it. Herr Giesberts, in conjunction with the Socialist Party leader Lesen, dealt with labor, von Stockhammern with economic capacity, and in cooperation with Herr Gauss with, quote, German rights and interests outside Germany, end quote. The industrialists Röchling and Hilger, together with the Social Democratic leader Zeklin, and assisted by officials of the Foreign Office with the Upper Silesian question, with Poland and other frontier problems, but it was Dr. Siemens who undertook the final revision and put the last polish on their drafts. The whole memorandum was informed with a spirit of resistance and resolute defense, modified by the reiterated willingness to make such sacrifices as equity and compliance with the agreement of November 1918 might require. Even this memorandum, however, could only touch upon the most important of the points at issue, and could not even deal with these exhaustively. It ended by demanding the opening now of proper negotiations. It emphasized the impossibility of Germany's representatives signing the treaty with any sense of binding responsibility until its form had been changed and the suggested amendments embodied in it, or an agreement reached as to the procedure to be adopted for effecting the necessary changes. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau affixed his signature to this memorandum, which his experts had taken pains to put together in as concise, as lucid, and as well-documented a form as possible. It was, in the main, a summary of what Germany felt bound to resist and refuse. He then proceeded to draw up a comprehensive covering letter to go with the memorandum to the chairman of the peace conference, setting forth in the clearest terms the legitimate sacrifices that Germany was prepared to make. He drew up, in German, French, and English, a list of the forfeits Germany was ready to pay. The state that had once been a fortress of militarism would be content with an army of 100,000 men, and would disarm completely in all other respects. Germany would even renounce her right to the 5 or 6 warships allotted to her by the treaty if she were going to become a member of the League of Nations. This offer had already been made to the conference by Count Rantzau a few days earlier. Next, the agreed surrenders of territory were summarized. As regards reparations, the Reich would undertake payments up to a maximum of 100 milliard gold marks. During the coming 10 years, she would deliver 140 million tons of coal alone as compensation for the destruction of the mines of northern France. In addition to this, France, Belgium, Italy, and Luxembourg would be supplied with coal, benzol, coal tar, dyestuffs, pharmaceutical products, and all sorts of other commodities. Germany would, quote, throw the whole of her merchant shipping into a world pool and place a certain proportion of the freightage at the disposal of the enemy countries on reparation account. At the same time, she would construct on their behalf in German shipyards over a period of years new merchant ships to a tonnage even exceeding what they had claimed, end quote. She would, in addition, deliver rivercraft to compensate for those destroyed on the Belgian and French rivers. Finally, Germany offered the enemy, quote, with a view to expediting the fulfillment of her reparation obligations, end quote, a share in her industrial undertakings. One counter-demand only the foreign minister included in his covering letter, but with emphasis. He insisted on the real facts regarding the question of war guilt being clearly ascertained by means of an international inquiry. Only if complete clarity were attained on this question, he claimed, could the present universal mistrust be removed and a suitable atmosphere be created for the formation of a League of Nations. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau now put his name to the covering letter, and this note, together with a detailed memorandum and the numerous appendices on special legal points, which had been prepared by Privy Councillor Goss, was delivered to the Peace Conference on May 29th. Nothing had come from the other side to the Hôtel des Reservoirs since the chairman's reply, 5 days earlier, on territorial questions and the proposed settlement in the Saar Valley, which had offered no concessions. Now the plenipotentiaries had, to the best of their convictions, said on behalf of Germany all that could be said in so short a space of time. They could do nothing more but wait and see what slight measure of success their efforts might bring forth. The next few days passed uneventfully. After the feverish haste to complete their work in the time allotted, The German delegates now made use of the permission to go for country drives. They also went over their material and embodied any fresh data they could think of in case the enemy should, after all, decide to negotiate. During this period, a French journalist called one day on Count Brockdorff-Rantzau in the hope of gleaning some information as to his willingness to sign the treaty. He opened in a tone of ironical flattery. Quote, "I expect Your Excellency will have seen in the Galerie des Maréchaux here the portrait of Field Marshal Josias Rantzau. Do you know, Your Excellency, that there is a legend that Louis XIV was an illegitimate son of this French field marshal?" End quote. "Oh, yes," the Count replied. "There is a tradition in our family to that effect, dating back 200 years. What comforts one about it is that, if the tradition is based on fact, the Rantzaus are not illegitimate Bourbons, but the Bourbons bastard Rantzaus." End quote. The Frenchman retired. He was succeeded by an Englishman who was the bearer of more important tidings. It seemed possible, in fact, that his visit was not without the knowledge and authorization of the British Prime Minister. Some slight change of attitude was obviously about to take place, or perhaps had already occurred in the enemy camp. In point of fact, the determined tone of the German covering letter had created in Lloyd George's mind a sudden feeling of disquiet, which promptly developed, such was his temperament, into unconcealed alarm lest the enemy's power of resistance should have been underestimated, and he should refuse to sign after all. He realized now that the terms were too harsh, and said so. He was in favor of making concessions. Alternative solutions to some of the problems could easily be found. By the end of the first week in June, the German delegation had gained the strong impression that their opponents were inclined to listen to counsels of moderation in certain directions. The non-committal conversations with the English emissary hinted at favorable modifications that Great Britain might be willing to accept in regard to merchant shipping and colonies, and France in regard to reparations, the Rhine, and Germany's eastern frontiers. On June 7, however, an unofficial, unconfirmed rumor reached the delegation from Berlin to the effect that Germany was prepared to sign the peace treaty. It seemed as if the Allies had received a similar message at the same time, which sufficed to bring about a fresh change in their attitude. The British Premier's emissary was seen no more. Lloyd George was reported as having resumed his talk of a stern resolve to enforce the demands embodied in the peace treaty with all available resources. All signs of a changed attitude in the other camp had disappeared. A week later, the German plenipotentiaries were roused to action again by the news that the peace conference had a definite communication to make to them. Far-reaching amendments had been made, they heard, as a result of Count Brockdorff-Rantzau's covering note. The revised terms were to be presented in the Hôtel des Reservoirs in the room overlooking the garden. The foreign minister returned the reply that he would send his general commissary to receive the communication. On July 17th, Colonel Henry, with a second officer, called for Dr. Siemens, who was accompanied by Baron von Lersner. The French officer disdained to take the shortcut across the courtyard of the hotel, but led the two delegates out into the road through the wire fence that shut off the hotel, past crowds of silent onlookers to the second turning which took them right round the building. At the end of this mummery, they entered the hotel again by the back door and reached the room looking onto the garden. Monsieur Dutasta, the General Secretary of the Peace Conference, handed Dr. Siemens a fresh copy of the peace terms with a message that the German delegation was required to announce its decision for or against signing within 3 days. Dr. Siemens immediately entered a protest against this time limit as being too short. The delegation could not come to a decision as regards signing the treaty on their own responsibility. The German federal constitution necessitated certain formalities, and the concurrence of each of the states of the Reich was requisite before they could either accept or decline the terms. Monsieur Dutasta took note of this protest. Then the procession returned by the same route. out of the little room, through the back door onto the street, behind the wire fence, through the silent, respectful crowds, the two French officers marching on either side of the German delegates. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau immediately called his experts together for a consultation. They had before them the same thick white volume which had been handed to the foreign minister 6 weeks before in the Trianon Palace Hotel. A few clauses had been crossed out in red ink and replaced by alternative provisions, also inserted in red ink in manuscript. This was the one and only copy of the final draft of the peace conference of the Allied and associated powers. The, quote, far-reaching amendments, end quote, were studied. Political sovereignty in the Saar territory was to be exercised not by France alone, but by a League of Nations commission of 5 members, one to be a Frenchman, one a non-French inhabitant of the Saar Basin, and the other 3 neither French nor German. The removal of the district from German sovereignty remained. The Polish question was finally settled, and a plebiscite granted for Upper Silesia. This was too little to make it possible to think of signing. Not a word about discussions or negotiations, no possibility of substantiating by the submission of evidence their contentions as to the irrefutable inequity or the impracticability of certain provisions. This last conference of the delegates at Versailles was filled with gloomy depression, but nonetheless all were firmly resolved to go before the National Assembly and urged that it was impossible for Germany to sign. The meeting was interrupted by a messenger from Clemenceau. He brought a written ultimatum. The exchange of notes must now cease. The peace conference required to know within the shortest possible time whether the terms were going to be signed or not. The time limit now offered was 5 days. An extension of 48 hours had been secured by the protest made by Dr. Siemens. This, however, made no practical difference. The foreign minister announced that he would leave that evening with the rest of the German delegation for Weimar, the seat of the German National Assembly. They packed in frantic haste. Only the boxes containing official documents were to accompany the delegates. Colonel Henry sent cars to convey the plenipotentiaries to Neuilly, from which station the special train for Germany was to start, but the number of cars was insufficient. The decision to leave had come too suddenly for the authorities at Versailles, who were supposed to be prepared for any eventuality. But it did not come suddenly enough to prevent demonstrations in the streets aroused by the news that the Germans were going away without having signed. The first cars left as twilight was deepening. Crowds still surrounded the Hôtel des Réservoirs, but the silent onlookers of the earlier part of the day had given place to a mob which groaned, hissed, and shouted. The Ligue des Patriots had assembled in force, while the police stood by and took no steps to prevent disorder. The first cars conveyed the subordinate officials. Only Herr von Heniel was staying behind at the Hôtel des Réservoirs with a small fraction of the delegation. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau entered the last car to the accompaniment of the loudest noise from the mob, which began to howl and whistle and looked about for missiles. The cars drove fairly slowly, and the rage of the crowd increased. Finally, stones began to fly. Herr Giesbert's car had one of the windows broken, and his lady secretary was wounded in the head. The French officers now ordered the speed to be increased. Neuilly was reached at last. The special train was very slow. The journey to Weimar was timed to take a whole day and 2 nights, and the delegates were anxious, in fact obliged, to make use of the time spent on the journey to draw up the memorandum which was to be laid before the National Assembly. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau presided over the meetings of the committees. Dr. Siemens was responsible for the arrangement of matter and undertook, as before, the final coordination of the memorandum. During the second night in the train, he dictated, on the basis of the committee's deliberations the day before, the report of the delegation, which was to serve at the same time as a resolution for the National Assembly proposing the rejection of the terms. The plenipotentiaries just had time to sign the report before the train entered the station at Weimar. Dr. Siemens had run through all the details at the last moment with Herr Giesberts, who remarked in utter exhaustion as the train came to a standstill, "I was half asleep when I signed." They reached Weimar in the early morning of June 19. The foreign minister drove straight to the ex-Grand Ducal Palace, where the members of the cabinet were assembled. End of section 19. Section 20 of Versailles by Karl Friedrich Nowak. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. The Surrender. At his interview with the cabinet, Count Brockdorff-Rantzau once more gave his reasons for recommending the rejection of the treaty. Gisberts and Landberg had accompanied him, and they could suggest no alternative to their leader's proposals. When he had completed his formal report, Count Rantzau went on to elaborate the considerations which had led him to make up his mind so definitely. "There are two slogans," he told the ministers, "which I was up against during the whole of the war: hold out and time is on our side. It is these same two slogans, strangely enough, that I find now I must adopt myself." End quote. He pointed out to the cabinet that the enemy governments would be bound to fall out among themselves within very little time, owing to the multiplicity of their interests and to their rival greeds and rapacities. He did not and could not know that they had actually passed that stage and reached agreement, nor that his proposed line of action was foredoomed to failure, chiefly because the evident indecision of the German government and the universally accepted rumors that it was going to give way had undermined the Allies' belief in the seriousness of his own opposition. Quote, "If we can hold out for 2 or 3 months, our enemies will be at loggerheads over the division of the spoils, and then we shall get better terms. If we sign now, no one will trouble to ask later on whether we signed under duress or not. Our signature will have provided them with a formal legal authorization for all their demands." End quote. He drove home his contention. Quote, "If we refuse to sign, we shall be in purgatory for a time, for 2 or at most 3 months. If we sign, it means a lingering disease of which the nation will perish." End quote. That was his whole message. The ministers listened without coming to a decision. Count Rantzau could not fathom exactly what their attitude was. In fact, the members of the cabinet themselves were at the moment uncertain which way their decision would go. Only the commander-in-chief, Noski, went so far as to assure the foreign minister, as the latter left the meeting, quote, "I am perfectly clear about it. I understand your point of view entirely." End quote. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau went into the park. He felt he had given the cabinet all the information they needed to come to a decision. Now he would simply be guided by their decision, whichever way it went. Meanwhile, he would get a breath of fresh air. The cabinet went on with their discussion, but after Count Rantzau's report and explanation, the two opposing camps, those in favor of signing and those against, had grown more sharply defined. The Prime Minister, Philip Scheidemann, had taken his stand already in a big public speech in Berlin. He had no choice left but to stand by his refusal to sign or else to resign office. Up to now, President Ebert had also been against signing, but his present attitude was uncertain. Herr Reinhardt, the war minister, was bound out of regard for his corps of officers to be against the acceptance of terms which would entail bringing their leaders in the war to trial. But Matthias Erzberger's convictions remained unshaken. He regarded submission as the only gateway to renaissance for Germany. He drew a lurid picture of the horrors that would inevitably follow immediately on a refusal. His remarks created a profound impression, and several members of the cabinet wavered. It was decided to question Count Brockdorff-Rantzau once more, and Erzberger was asked to send for him. In the meantime, Dr. Siemens was summoned and asked a few questions on points of detail. Erzberger reported that the foreign minister was nowhere to be found, but Dr. Dernberg sent out into the park, and the Count returned to the palace. The suggestion had been made that it might be feasible to sign with the proviso that Germany would not undertake to surrender the ex-Kaiser and the military leaders. This was now to be discussed. The commander-in-chief, Noski, had been sent for out of the cabinet room to receive a report of a meeting which the army leaders had just held. Some of them had still been declaring that military resistance could be continued if an appeal were made to the whole nation to support it. Noski had ordered a detailed plan to be prepared for such an attempt and was now examining it. These army leaders' views had also been communicated to Field Marshal von Hindenburg, who sent the following reply to the commander-in-chief. Quote, "If hostilities were resumed, we should be able from a military point of view to recover the province of Posen and to defend our frontiers in the east. But in the west, in view of the numerical superiority of the Entente powers, which enables them to hem us in on both flanks, we could hardly hope for success if the enemy attacked seriously. The success of the operation as a whole would, therefore, be very doubtful. But as a soldier, I can only prefer honorable defeat to a disgraceful peace." End quote. Noski concluded that resistance by the army and by a national rising would be futile. On his return to the cabinet meeting, he at once took pains to remove any uncertainty on this point, speaking bluntly and unromantically, as he always did when he was faced with any attempt to gloss over hard facts. A new military adventure had a very different aspect here in Weimar from what it would look like at the frontiers if the enemy crossed them, and they would not stop short at the frontiers. He brushed the project aside. Quote, "It is all very fine for us 15 heroes to sit here and refuse to sign, but behind us there is a nation which is down and out. What is the use of heroics on the part of 15 leaders in that situation?" End quote. Noski had now turned completely round from his attitude of the same morning, when he had approved Count Brockdorff-Ransau's policy. He had now reached the same conclusions as Erzberger, albeit from quite a different direction and from different motives. He had no faith in the enemy's lenience. He regarded the peace terms as an enormity, an outrageous act of naked violence, but he felt that the nation's morale had gone. Consequently, there was no alternative but to sign. Resistance would be something even worse than the gambler's plunge, which Erzberger was calling it to the foreign minister's face. It would be sheer madness. Matthias Erzberger was infuriated at Count Ransau's proposal to take upon himself the responsibility of saying no at Versailles, with all it involved. But he was mistaken in thinking that the Count was still dreaming of reawakening the roar of the guns, of a last heroic stand. Count Brockdorff-Ransau knew that the German people would not listen to any further suggestion of military self-sacrifice. He was as convinced of that as Noski or as Erzberger himself. But he still clung to the belief that dissensions in the camp of the Allies would soon make it possible for Germany to secure more reasonable peace terms. The cabinet was divided almost equally, and a struggle between the foreign minister and Erzberger remained in the balance. The president, who had grown more and more silent, stood between the opposing groups of cabinet ministers, all irresolute and weighed down with their grave responsibility. Late that night, Count Brockdorff-Ransau had an interview with the president alone. Ebert's suspended judgment had given place to visible depression. Quote, "Since these divisions have become public property," said the foreign minister, "we have lost our best trump cards for negotiating with the enemy." End quote. The president did not reply, and the foreign minister went on. "The solidarity of the cabinet no longer exists, and the enemy know it. We must shoulder the consequences." End quote. The president did not ask how he was to take this statement, whether the foreign minister was now coming round to the view that there was no alternative left but to agree to sign, or whether he was suggesting that the president ought to use the full weight of his authority to endeavor to heal the breach in the cabinet and engineer a unanimous vote against signing. He only repeated in a tired voice, "Yes, we must." There was no course left open to the foreign minister but to resign. But it chanced that on the following day he heard that the Federal Chamber, State House, had decided to debate the question of the peace treaty to give the representatives of the various German states and their governments the opportunity to speak. Count Rantzau determined to make one last attempt. He would address first the Federal Chamber and then the National Assembly, and urged that Germany should refuse to sign. He attended the meeting and gave once more a full explanation of his point of view. But Erzberger was not to be silenced. Quote, "If we don't sign, then the niggers will come and ravish our wives and girls and children." End quote. The southern and western states were inclined to favor signing the treaty. They were nearest to the enemy armies and feared devastation, reprisals, looting, atrocities of all sorts. The prophecy held out by Erzberger was more than enough to decide them. He had referred to things that would certainly happen, the foreign minister to a turn of the tide that at best was reasonably possible. The representative of Hesse got up to express his view. Quote, "What Mr. Secretary Schön has said sounds well enough, but there's no getting away from the fact that it is merely surmise." End quote. Someone whispered a correction. Count Brockdorff-Rantzau, but the representative of Hesse cared nothing for names or persons. He repeated, "Very well, Mr. Brockdorff, then. What I said of Mr. Schön applies equally to Mr. Brockdorff-Rantzau." End quote. The foreign minister gave up the struggle. He had prepared a big speech for the National Assembly, but the speech was never delivered. He had lost, though he did not admit defeat for his policy or his attitude. He wrote to President Ebert, quote, "Weimar, June 20, 1919. To the President of the Reich. Sir, when I assumed the direction of Germany's foreign policy, I explicitly accepted the twofold task of maintaining the unity of the Reich and securing a tolerable peace for the German nation. In taking over the office, I also made certain stipulations of a political nature, and these have been honorably adhered to in my favor so far as circumstances allowed. The foreign policy that I pursued could only be supported by reason and argument. As a result of her military defeat, her political revolution, and the economic disabilities inflicted by the armistice, Germany's material power no longer existed. Nevertheless, I venture to assert that I have succeeded in raising her political credit abroad. I ascribe this success to the fact that I have never deviated from the path along which I set out to guide the foreign policy of the Reich. With a full sense of responsibility, I formulated certain far-reaching minimum requirements for the coming peace in such definite terms that I cannot now depart from them without forfeiting all claims to be regarded as politically sincere. These minimum requirements refer chiefly to territorial problems, to the repudiation of the unjust charges against our nation in regard to responsibility for the war, and to the preservation of our social and economic freedom. It was with deliberate intent that I took a public stand on these points, and that I definitely committed myself in face of the enemy, for I wished them to realize, amid all the intoxication of victory, that firm determination could set limits to their power. I came back from Versailles in the confident hope that my policy would be crowned with success if only the German nation supported me and was ready to face the grave dangers. I fully recognize their gravity, with which the enemy are threatening and endeavoring to intimidate us. The discussions here at Weimar have, however, shown me that there are considerations of internal politics, more especially the prevalent conception of the psychological condition of our sorely tried nation, which render it impossible, in the eyes of the government, to venture the risk without which my plan cannot succeed. It was, I am convinced, no mere gambler's throw. It merely called for firmness and self-confidence. I have not lost confidence myself. The German nation is now the principal champion of democratic ideals in the world. There is a world mission of which Germany is the chosen instrument, but which she can only fulfill if she does not lose faith in herself. To stand clearly and unambiguously for a policy of democratic self-determination and social justice is Germany's main justification in the future. This and implacable hostility to the capitalism and imperialism which are enshrined in the enemy's draft peace terms will ensure her a glorious future. On the very threshold of success, however, I am compelled at present to turn back. It has thus become impossible for me to continue to direct Germany's foreign policy. I do not wish to imply that a servant of the Crown has any right to decline to carry on his functions if the force of circumstances induces his government to come to decisions which he regards as essentially mistaken. It is not a question of whether I personally feel the direction of a policy based on the acceptance of the enemy's terms to be tolerable or not. On quite other grounds, I should consider it a grave mistake, fatal to the success of the foreign policy of the Reich, if I were to remain in office. Any other German cabinet minister might modify his attitude towards the peace terms if internal conditions were to demand it, without arousing criticism from abroad. But for a foreign minister to participate in such a modified policy after having publicly disassociated himself from it would prejudice the dignity and the credit of the Reich. If his foreign policy has proved to be impracticable, then he must cease to represent his country in international affairs. If Germany now accepts the enemy's peace terms, there are certain political benefits to be reaped from this enormous sacrifice: a relaxation of tension in foreign relations, the allaying of the feelings of hatred and revenge, the withdrawal of the enemy troops, a paving of the way towards real peace negotiations. All these benefits would be jeopardized, perhaps even go by the board entirely, if the new international relations had to be conducted by a man who has repudiated the enemy's conditions so vigorously as I have done. If the present treaty is to be signed, either with or without reservations, if an attempt is to be made, against my convictions, to purchase some further relaxation of the terms by concessions which go beyond the limits I have fixed, then this new policy must be carried on by a new foreign minister, by a man less committed than I am. I deeply regret having to cause the government, and particularly you, sir, further difficulties by my resignation. But the only course which I can reconcile with my conscience as the minister responsible for German foreign policy is to insist respectfully on being relieved of my office. Brockdorff Rantzau. End quote. The foreign minister left the political arena with the dignity of a grand seigneur, the same dignity that had been his most precious gift to his country on the day of her humiliation in the Trianon Palace Hotel. He could not stay in the cabinet, as the government was obviously tending towards a solution other than his convictions and conscience would admit. He was averse to staying in any case, since he regarded the cabinet as responsible, through its disunity and the opportunities it thereby gave the enemy, for the impotence of his own policy. Dr. Siemens did not wish to stay in the Foreign Office without his chief. Count Rantzau reminded him that, if he too resigned, there would be no one left to carry on the main lines of policy hitherto followed. But Dr. Siemens saw no chance of saving any part of their policy from the wreck. He asked permission to resign and followed the minister into private life. Just about the same time, the young French professor Hesnard was finding a great deal to report to his superior, Professor Hagenen. He had been to Weimar for a fortnight, having come there on his own initiative, but with the special sanction of his elder colleague, who thought he himself ought not to leave Berlin. Professor Hesnard was doing his best to imbibe all the views and standpoints of parties, ministers, and politicians generally, which might have any bearing on the question of the signing of the treaty. Members of the right parties, of the center, even of the Democratic Party, made no secret of their conviction that it was chiefly the points of honor, the surrender of the Kaiser and his generals, which made the treaty unacceptable for them. Men of the left parties said the same about the economic terms. The only discordant view, on the whole, was that of some of the communist leaders whom Professor Hesnard questioned. The Communist Party had, indeed, already issued a special manifesto in the midst of the Versailles negotiations, calling publicly for the signing of the treaty under any conditions. This had marked, in Count Rantzau's view, the first important weakening of the German will to resistance. Now Haas, the leader of the independent socialists, also assured the French professor that it was inevitable that the treaty should be signed. Dr. Siemens had sent an emissary, Dr. Melchior, to this particular labor leader at the beginning of June, at the time when the former had had occasion to leave Versailles for Berlin, to point out emphatically, quote, the fatal damage that his policy might do, and to tell him that one of the few chances to improve on the peace terms lay in a concerted protest by the whole international labor movement, including the sections in the enemy countries, against the imperialist and capitalist nature of the Allies' draft treaty, a protest which would naturally be stultified if the German labor movement were to declare in favor of the treaty, end quote. But in his interview with Professor Lienhart, Haas showed no change in his attitude, except that he added, as a sort of mental reservation, at least the Frenchman took it as such, that, although the enemy could count on getting Germany's signature, it remained to be seen whether the terms could be carried out. Thus the agreement of the left-wing socialist parties was assured, and Professor Lienhart devoted his attention to the unacceptable terms according to the moderate socialists, those relating to the economic penalties, endeavoring to persuade them by reference to books, statistics, and graphs sent at his request from Paris relating to the destruction caused by Germany in Belgium and northern France, that the extreme demands were necessary and inevitable. The socialists were silent and made no reply thereafter when they were asked whether Germany would sign. Erzberger saw Lienhart almost every day. At first he came to him full of indignation, flushed with anger. Quote, these points of honor are quite unacceptable. No German will stand them, end quote. The young Professor Lienhart made it clear that he was in no sense authorized to give any official information on the subject, but suggested that, after all, theory and practice were two different things, here as everywhere. As he had mentioned several times already in Berlin, Erzberger and the political parties must not think that the Kaiser and his generals would actually be treated quite so badly as they imagined. The minister went away feeling less worried than when he had arrived, and repeated what he had heard to his colleagues and the other parties. The professor also naturally reported to his superior what he had heard and the statements he himself had made. Professor Hagenen, who was in a position to discuss any and every point with the President and the Prime Minister of the French Republic, was able to give any explanations or interpretations in much more definite terms and in a much more official and responsible tone. He reiterated and confirmed the assurances which Professor Lienhart had given in the form of suggestions as to what was likely actually to happen and to the exaggerated nature of the Germans' fears for the future. As a result of these parleys, Matthias Erzberger became, if he was not already, the busiest of all the German ministers, and when Professor Lienhart again questioned representative members of the Democratic and Center parties, and even some from the right, about the way the decision was likely to go, their unacceptable had a fainter ring about it, restrained, diffident, sounding almost like acceptable. Anyhow, the French observer gradually began to get quite a definite impression, which grew to a certainty, that Germany would definitely not decline to sign the treaty, even in its existing form. While the cabinet were still at the height of their debates, and the division of opinion, for and against, was still almost equal, he reported to Professor Hagenen, as I see it, the peace treaty will be accepted. Just that, and nothing more. It cannot be asserted as a fact that Professor Hagenen had actually reported to Paris the suggestions of probable leniency that his emissary had put into circulation at Weimar, even though he had himself confirmed the benign assurances given to Herr Erzberger. But it is quite certain that he immediately repeated to Paris Lienhart's latest message from Weimar, greatly surprised as he was at the definiteness of the prophecy. In those days, many people in Germany talked to Professor Hagenen about peace and the prospects of peace, and all who did so were bound to acknowledge the spirit of conciliation with which everything he said was filled. In person, he was a man of very polished exterior and aristocratic mien, notwithstanding his thick-set build and powerful neck, but when in thought he was inclined to moodiness, and his glance often left his interlocutor and strayed into vacancy. He was a lover of good company and good fare, and a devoted amateur both of the arts and the sciences. Thus, he seemed quite obviously a stranger to all the machinations of hatred and dissension among the peoples, if only by reason of the adverse effect which such estrangements always have on scholarly pursuits, on the fine arts, and on the material joys of life. It is true that the professor's standing in Germany and his conciliatory efforts were slightly prejudiced by the fact that he was the emissary of Poincaré and Clemenceau, and a close personal friend of both, for it was inevitable that he should be guided in various ways by the particular aims of his two chiefs. He was not well off, but for years past had got out of the habit of watching his expenditure. Since he had been in the employ of the French government, he had been entrusted with numerous confidential missions, the first being in Switzerland during the war, and he had often been surprised at the munificence of his employers, who remitted to him any amount he asked for as expenses without troubling him for details. And it was not only his political career which depended on the extent to which he gave satisfaction in Paris. He dared not, from sheer bread-and-butter motives, jeopardize his position in Berlin, which in the ordinary course might be expected to develop into confidential employment in a larger sphere in the German capital. His needs were considerable and his means limited. His health had been undermined by an intemperate youth, and he had to take care and treat himself as an invalid. He was averse to any sort of excitement, and it was most natural that he should instinctively show a conciliatory front to the defeated enemy of yesterday, while taking, of course, all the precautions that stern necessity dictated to keep in with his powerful patrons in Paris. It was entirely in line with his own sentiments to speak of a coming age of leniency in his conversations at Weimar and Berlin, but he had to bear in mind at the same time that the Council of Four themselves were by no means quite confident, were indeed in the highest degree worried and apprehensive as to Germany's intention of signing the treaty. In these circumstances, it was a matter of the greatest moment to know just what was likely to happen, whether this concession or that would be required in order to reach a final settlement, or whether concessions were entirely unnecessary, since Germany would swallow everything in any case, so that the professor was only doing his duty, which, after all, had no necessary connection with his own general inclination towards conciliatory measures, when he telegraphed to his government in Paris, quote, "Germany will sign unconditionally. Don't give anything away," end quote, and meanwhile left his colleague Hesnard to continue the Weimar conversations in accordance with the lines he had himself laid down. To secure some relaxation at least of the harshest terms of all, the elimination of the points of honor, the minimal alleviations which Count Brockdorff-Rantzau had declared in resigning to be in his belief unobtainable whatever sacrifices the government might agree to make. This was the final effort carried on first by the old cabinet until it was forced by the crisis to resign, and then by a new government formed in haste and with difficulty. The peace treaty required not only that the Kaiser and the generals should be apprehended and brought to trial before enemy tribunals, together with all other, quote, persons accused of having committed acts in violation of the laws and customs of war, end quote, but also that Germany should herself carry out the bailiff's function of apprehending the accused, and should voluntarily provide all documents and information of every kind needed for the trial of these German subjects. The new cabinet drafted the following formula for the acceptance of the treaty, which seemed to them to be the only possible wording. Quote, "The government of the German Republic is prepared to sign the peace treaty, without, however, acknowledging that the German nation is the sole author of the war, and without accepting the obligations laid down in Articles 227 to 230 of the treaty," end quote. A draft of a final note, in which an attempt was made to secure the remnants of some exiguous concessions, to save some few scraps of German territory and German trades, to save the German people at least from the spectacle of the trial of its leaders, was sent off to Herr von Henniel, who was instructed to obtain the concurrence of the peace conference to these proposals. The cabinet as a whole was skeptical of success, but one minister at least prophesied that this last effort would bear fruit. But the will to resistance was at its last gasp. Early on Sunday morning, June 22nd, the National Assembly met to discuss the wording of the formula by which the government were to be authorized to sign the treaty. The two parties represented in the new cabinet, the Social Democrats and the Center, proposed a resolution in the following terms. Quote, "The National Assembly approves of the attitude of the government in regard to the signing of the peace treaty." End quote. But protests were raised. To express definite approval of such a step was more than the Assembly could or would tolerate. An amendment was proposed in these words, quote, "The National Assembly agrees to authorize the government to sign the peace treaty." End quote. Representatives of the parties of the right were loud in their protestations. To say they agreed would mean that they accepted everything, without mentioning that it was done under duress, without any reservation. But even as they spoke, the protesters knew that their protests were only of theatrical importance. Everything depended on von Henniel's reply, on the wire from the Hôtel des Reservoirs. If no reply were received, the treaty would have to be signed unconditionally, or else the cabinet would have to decide on a resumption of war, of the hopeless defensive war of a disarmed nation. The time limit set by the peace conference was expiring. Only a few hours were left. The telegram from von Henniel reported the very opposite of success. The peace conference would abate not a jot or tittle of their terms. The reply was unsparing in its directness and harsh in its wording. It had been drafted this time by the President of the United States instead of by the French Prime Minister, although it bore Clemenceau's signature. It was Wilson who served out to Germany her iron ration of freedom with a frigid, formal cruelty, a supercilious matter-of-factness, which was perhaps largely a pathological display of relish in a style which was not at all his forte, and which he was now employing as the gravedigger of his own idealism in an attempt to out-Herod Herod. Quote, "Sir, the Allied and associated powers have considered the note of the German delegation of even date, and in view of the shortness of the time remaining, feel it their duty to reply at once. Of the time within which the German government must make their final decision as to the signature of the treaty, less than 24 hours remain. The Allied and associated governments have given the fullest consideration to all of the representations hitherto made by the German government with regard to the treaty, have replied with complete frankness, and have made such concessions as they thought it right to make, and the present note of the German delegation presents no arguments or considerations not already examined. The Allied and associated powers therefore feel constrained to say that the time for discussion is past. They can accept or acknowledge no qualification or reservation, and must require of the German representatives an unequivocal decision as to their purpose to sign and accept as a whole, or not to sign and accept the treaty as finally formulated." End quote. The French Prime Minister had only to add, in his own objective way, quote, "After the signature, the Allied and associated powers must hold Germany responsible for the execution of every stipulation of the treaty. I have, etc., Clemenceau." End quote. That was the end. There was no need for further discussion. Now it was for the President of the Reich to decide what choice he should make for Germany. The Commander-in-Chief, Noske, had just left for Berlin, having been called away, together with his staff, to deal with urgent business. He was stopped and brought back to Weimar by special train. Once more the fateful question was canvassed. Shall we resist? General Gruner, the Quartermaster General of the forces, was consulted at the 11th hour. He knew the state of the army, officers and men. His views had changed since the day when, 2 months before, he had demanded that Germany's position as a great power, as a power whose value as an ally would be unimpaired, should be safeguarded at all costs. He thought differently now about the Wilsonian ethics and their potency. Speaking to his officers at GHQ 5 short weeks after his previous pronouncement, he had painted another picture of a Germany in the grip of fate. Quote, "I have reconciled myself to the fact that Germany has fallen to the rank of a second-rate power through her defeat in the war. The aim that we must now, in my opinion, set before ourselves is to hold the 60 million Germans firmly together in one single state, as far as possible a centralized state. A new state must be formed, radiating from the plains of northern Germany, and for the present this will have to be a second-class power. When we have attained this, a great deal will have been gained. And if we then go on steadily working, training up new leaders from our younger generation who will adapt themselves to the needs of the new age and supersede the stupid, antiquated German party system, which largely represents the survival of obsolete, effete ideas, then I consider we shall have consolidated our future. Then I do not see why we should not forge ahead again, especially in the economic field. In a military sense, gentlemen, I am personally convinced that our progress will be slow. I am not under any illusions in that score, because I know too well what the aims of our enemies are." End quote. On the same day on which the German delegation left the Hôtel des Reservoirs at Versailles, General Griner reviewed once more the four alternatives which remained for organizing armed resistance on the Eastern Front. Three of these he rejected outright as soon as he mentioned them in his memorandum, but the fourth needed more careful consideration. The plan was to deal with Poland first, to attack and annihilate the armies of the new state, and then to turn between the Bug and the Vistula and advance to meet the oncoming allies in a final engagement. But even here, the more he looked into the plan, the more he found nothing but contradictory reports, doubts, and uncertainty. When finally he was consulted by telephone, he had faced the bitter reality. He gave the following unequivocal reply, quote, "I am bound to report that a campaign in the East, though temporary successes might be registered, would offer no prospect of ultimate victory. Moreover, unless you, Noski, explain in a public proclamation that the conclusion of peace is a stern necessity, and call upon every officer and man to remain at his post to safeguard the fatherland after peace has been signed, and to continue to do his duty to his country, there is little prospect of the army supporting you and thus preventing the recurrence both of insurrectionary movements in the interior and of skirmishes with the enemy in the east." End quote. All idea of final resistance thus fell to the ground. The commander-in-chief took no notice of General Griner's request that a public proclamation should be issued. He realized that the Reich had now reached the most desperate of all its crises. A number of the generals had announced that they would resign if the treaty were signed. That would mean chaos and the dissolution of even the remnants of material power which Germany still had at her disposal for the maintenance of public order. Rather than witness such chaos, he would prefer the enemy to march in. That would, at any rate, stimulate a revival of national self-respect. 3 days before, Noski had agreed with Count Brockdorff-Rantzau, just back from Versailles. Then he had appeared to favor a refusal to sign the treaty. On the next day he had scorned all idea of resistance, saying that the whole nation was down and out. Then he had appeared to favor signing the treaty. Now he feared that, with the breakup of the army, the backbone of the nation would surely give way, and that would be the end of all things. The commander-in-chief, therefore, now refused to agree to the treaty being signed. Let the enemy come. He would resign. The decision was left almost entirely with President Ebert. He had canvassed all possible points of view. The majority of the cabinet were in favor of signing. The National Assembly could suggest no other alternative, and spoke not of a national rising, but of submission. Right up to the last, the president had been secretly thinking of resisting, but General Griner's last report made the very idea a crime against the nation. The enemy hordes would not only penetrate from the west, but there would be war on the Polish front, and possibly with Czechoslovakia too. Noski's resignation would certainly bring the crisis to a head, but the generals would be persuaded to stay, and perhaps the commander-in-chief would then follow suit. That would mean that the army remained intact, and internal order would be safeguarded at any rate. An end must be put to this uncertainty, and there seemed no other way. The president gave his decision in favor of signing unconditionally without protest, as had been demanded. Von Heneo was to be instructed accordingly. The young French professor dashed to the telephone and rang up the Hotel Adlon in Berlin. The lift boy took down a message in a slip of paper at Hesnard's dictation, hung up the receiver, went up in the lift, and pushed the slip under the door of Professor Hagenen's room, as he had been in the habit of doing several times a day for the past fortnight. Professor Hagenen was out, but the moment he returned, he repeated to the French Prime Minister the message brought by the lift boy. Germany had decided to sign the peace treaty. The signature was duly carried out on June 28, 1919, in the Mirror Hall at Versailles, on behalf of the German Reich by the new Foreign Minister, Hermann Müller, and the new Minister of Justice, Dr. Bell, two lonely men in frock coats among countless uniforms and diplomatist costumes glittering with gold lace. When night fell, Paris went mad amid a sea of pyrotechnics. Guns boomed from the roof of the Invalides. American soldiers, crazy with joy, wearing women's hats on their helmets in their excitement, ran wild along the boulevards, arm in arm with their triumphant French comrades. Every town in Germany hoisted mourning flags at half-mast. The political leaders and delegates of the various countries said farewell to the joys of Paris. The President of the United States left France without delay. The instrument of peace, which he had been the first to sign, was not countersigned by the Senate. The President resolved to address the American people direct, to explain his ideas, to explain himself, to defend himself. He journeyed from town to town, restlessly delivering speech after speech. He spoke from pulpits, from platforms, from a special train, appealing everywhere, north and south, to the mass of the people. His entourage and his private doctor grew more and more concerned, more and more alarmed to observe a sudden, ominous change taking place in their harassed chief, who had once dreamed of this tour as a triumphant progress. The president was breaking up. His gaunt body began to hang loose, fleshless, like a skeleton. Often now his words came strangely labored from a stammering tongue. He spoke of his ideals, of the divine spark of international reconciliation, that spark which it was his sole achievement to have brought into the world. But his speech was dull and uninspired, and his audiences merely laughed. His eternal values were alien to American thought. His excuses for the attitude he had adopted, his apologia for the self-betrayal which he persisted in denying, failed to convince. Whenever he grew excited, the convulsive twitching which had been noticeable in his face from time to time in Paris came again, and would not leave him. At last he collapsed. He went back to his study in the White House at Washington, from which he had sallied out barely a year before as a new savior of the world, completely broken up, hopelessly ill, surrounded by an atmosphere of secret dread, which his household did not dare to penetrate. A man marked down. Woodrow Wilson died on February 3, 1924. He had lain for some time helpless after a stroke. He died of a palsy. End of section 20. End of Versailles by Karl Friedrich Nowak.